Facebook.
Thank you. And the closed captioning, okay. English. Okay. All right, so we're ready to go. Well, welcome everybody to the Journal-isms Roundtable, especially those on Facebook who are watching and who will be watching later on YouTube. The Journal-isms, my name is Richard Prince, and I write a column called Journal-isms, Journal-isms at journal-isms.com, which is about diversity issues in the news business. And this Journal-isms Roundtable is an extension of that. We've been getting together since 1999 every month. And it started off when one of our friends, journalist friends, was leaving to go get a doctorate out in California. And she said, "Well, keep this going while I'm gone," and we have. So it's been, like I say, it's been going on. We met in person at local restaurants here in Washington, D.C. And once the pandemic began, we switched to Zoom, where we have dramatically increased the number of people who can attend. We have worldwide attendees now, and we have to be careful about what time zones we're scheduling these for. But we're as I said, we're doing this on Zoom now, and this will be, I believe, it may be our last Zoom only meeting, because next month we will be meeting in person as well as having this on Zoom at American University, who are our partners. And there we will have Dr. Julius Garvey, who is a son of Marcus Garvey. And we want to hear what he's up to, but also talk about a little bit about the journalism that Marcus Garvey practiced with his newspaper called The Negro World, which circulated all around the country and also internationally. So there's that. So welcome to this roundtable. We're here to network and to learn, we say, even if the networking goes on in the chat room. So please make liberal use of the chat room for comments, to drop links there, just to say things that you couldn't say live in the Zoom. And we'll go on. We'll look forward to that. After the session is over, we'll print out all the comments, and everybody on the call will be able to get a copy of that. So there's that. Now, since the time we started the idea for this roundtable, we had the tragic events in Memphis, and I told a couple of people who were listed as our panelists whether they think that the history of police violence against African Americans has any relationship to the reparations movement.
Absolutely.
And the justification.
Absolutely.
So I'll let them all. I think Kenny's already responded, and I suspect that he might be speaking for others as well. So I want to ask that question of all of our speakers, and I want to start off with Ellis Cose, who is going to, can just give us an overview. He drew up a one-pager about the state of the reparations movement. And he's got his book out too, which is called Race and Reckoning, From Founding Fathers to Today's Disruptors. Ellis, I want to limit everybody, if they can keep their comments to 3 minutes, because we have a lot of people.
Sure.
So quick 3-minute summary of what you want to tell.
Well, I guess my function was to sort of look at the history. Yeah, and I've done this anyway, because a lot of this history is included in Race and Reckoning. But you can't really talk about reparations without talking about the Civil War. And you can't really talk about reparations without talking about General William Sherman's order. His special order is number 15, which basically laid out a plan to divide among former enslaved people, freedmen, land that he had taken in his grand march through the South, and basically what he laid out was a plan to give up to 40 acres to formerly enslaved people, which would be which would be allocated for them to work and do with as they wished. The problem, of course, is that 4 months later, after he issued his order, the president, who was then Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, and who, unlike Lincoln, was both a Democrat and a racist, thought this program was ridiculous. And in addition, as you may or may not know, depending upon how much of your Civil War history you've absorbed, Andrew Johnson was the same president who vetoed the first civil rights bill for the freedmen, using the argument that under this civil rights bill, formerly enslaved people, Africans, would get more rights than whites had. So he was very concerned about protecting that. But he basically returned with the land back to the rebels, back to the folks who had started the Civil War, and left the freedmen high and dry. Even though General Sherman opposed this, and General Sherman, I should mention, came up with this plan after actually meeting with a very impressive group of formerly enslaved people, and asking them what they needed to get on their feet and what would make sense. And he went back and he thought about it and he said, these people make a lot of sense. And he came up with this 40 acres rule, 40 acres thing. It went away in 1865. It's never come back. And we have had some history with this. I mean, you had James Farmer in 1969 with his National Black Economic Conference, who basically under his so-called Black Manifesto endorsed a demand for $500 million in reparations, which ultimately became $3 billion, but which also ultimately went nowhere. John Conyers, for years proposed legislation to study the issue of reparations with the idea to ultimately make that come truth. I actually had sat down on several occasions with Conyers and asked him about this project, which seemed rather futile, quite frankly, and asked him why he kept doing it. And he said he thought it was important that the issue be raised. And he's absolutely right. Sheila Jackson Lee.
No, John Conyers was a longtime congressman from Detroit. Right. And who did you mention from CORE? I've forgotten now, right?
James Foreman.
Yeah, James Foreman was active. Wait a minute, was he in CORE or SNCC?
He was the SNCC. Then he went to CORE later, as I recall.
Right, got it.
But and Sheila Jackson Lee has taken up the charge, and every year she now proposes that legislation. At the same time, I mean, Gallup did a poll back in 1969 asking about this to Black and white Americans. And interestingly, a slight majority of Blacks were opposed to reparations, but a huge majority of whites were opposed to reparations. 90% of whites and only 2% were for it. The more recent polling, which has come from Pew and other people, has essentially 80% of whites for it, and the majority of Blacks for it at this point. And we've also had the backdrop where a host of cities and states, particularly cities, have gotten into the business and have started programs, what they call reparations programs. Most notably Evanston, which has been criticized, among other things, for not being a true reparations program, but being a land grant program or one sort or a land subsidy program, for one sort or another. So I think and we're in the state of play now where you have a number of these programs springing up across the city. Most notably in California, where the governor convened a commission to look at this issue, and also several cities within California are looking at the issues. And I guess I'll make a couple more points and then stop, because I think I'm over my 3 minutes. One is that despite all the enthusiasm for reparations in certain cities and in some states, in terms of getting general white buy-in to this, we will only move the meter, from 2% up, for in the 1960s, to 18% now, and you still have 80% opposed. We also have a situation where the Republican Party is engaged in a huge effort to whitewash all of our history, which would whitewash the explanations, for reparations. And you also have a conservative Supreme Court and a number of state legislators and others who would love to get into this issue and challenge it legally. We're in a very different situation than Germany, which passed two acts, one in 1956, another in 1957, for restitution for the Jews who were disadvantaged. The huge difference is, in one, Germany was occupied for part of that time where they're coming up with this. Two, this was barely 10 years after the end of World War II. And so it was much easier to designate who had been directly harmed by this and who was owed something. Whereas in the United States, as we all know, slavery ended with the Civil War in 1865. So I think I'll leave it there, Richard, just in terms of laying some background.
Very good. Thank you, Ellis. Let me point out also that this is an issue that's beyond black and white. The Pew survey also included Hispanic and Asian American views on this issue, and they were somewhere between the black and the white. But also, one of the interesting sidebars to all this is the reaction of Japanese Americans who had gotten some reparations, received some reparations because of the Japanese internment.
The internment in 1942, yes.
Right. And some of them have lined up behind the African American efforts to get reparations, which is interesting. And also,
let me just append to that, Richard.
Yes.
That legislation was hugely fought and was quite a victory. And one of the reasons that it was fought so fiercely was they wanted to get this legislation passed when they were still survivors around from the 1942 internment, which again makes it somewhat different from the situation we're talking about, in terms of reparations for African Americans.
Yes. And also Native Americans have also campaigned for reparations as well. I see that Ruben Navarrete is here, and I asked him to join us because he wrote a column about Mexican Americans and their stance on reparations. So, Ruben, what did you write?
Good to be with you all. So for those of you who aren't familiar with me, I've been a nationally syndicated columnist with the Washington Post Writers Group for 22 years. In that time, I've written about race, culture, immigration a lot, and I think offended just about everybody on all sides of all issues. What I wrote, I was struck by what's going on in California, my native state, around the issue of reparations. And jumping off on something Ellis said, I had written last year about the anniversary of the Japanese internment. And I'd done some research about that. You have to understand that the parallel here in many cases is the internment wasn't just about interning the Japanese, it was about stealing their land. So a lot of Japanese farmers lost their land once they were interned, then their neighbors came over and took over their land. And in many cases, those families never got it back.
Right.
So there was a compensation portion. It would be wrong to believe that somehow California found religion and said, oh, we mistreated the Japanese, we need to make it right. There was the thievery aspect of it. And that is also something that African Americans see playing out in their community here in California with regard to what happened at Bruce's Beach. So if you know Southern California, one of the more ritzy parts of Southern California is Manhattan Beach, or Manhattan, Hermosa, Redondo Beach. And there's Bruce's Beach was a beachfront property that belonged to Black residents. It was owned by Black residents until it was taken by the state through eminent domain in the 20th century, right? The family fought, they got the land back. They recently now said they're going to sell it back to Los Angeles County for $20 million. So good for them, happy ending. There's a case of the state of California not just mistreating African Americans, which did happen, but stealing from them. So in those cases where people get stuff stolen from them, like Mexican Americans had land stolen from them in California and in Texas and Arizona. In Texas, thanks to the Texas Rangers. If there's outright theft, I think there's a very strong case to be made for reparations.
Can I make a point, Ruben?
What's happening in California is, as you know, what happens in legislatures, they start off with an idea, then it kind of expands out. Well, by the time the commission was done and the legislature is done, this is all going to come to a head in July 1st. The commission is supposed to submit to the legislature its final recommendations, and it looks like there will be some reparations. There was an interesting debate that some of you may have seen within the commission. African Americans within the commission arguing with other African Americans on the commission, and the issue was whether the reparations should be limited to Black people who were in the United States as of the 19th century, whether they were freed or enslaved, or whether it should be broader. They basically said, no, these should be limited to people who were here, not recent arrivals. And maybe now there's a debate also about when you got to California. So there's a discussion there, sort of the devil's in the details in terms of limiting it and who gets it. But I'll end with this. I was struck by just how sweeping the discussion became. It does include task forces focused on alleged harm done to African Americans in the form of property seized by the government, which I already said is 100% solid case. It goes to devaluation also of Black-owned businesses, housing discrimination, homelessness, health issues, mass incarceration, and over-policing. As you can imagine, as it got broader, it's going to get more complicated to make the argument that somehow, not that African Americans haven't suffered in all those things, but that all of those things should merit some sort of reparation. My column was basically to say very simply, Mexican Americans have been victimized in this country since the beginning. We have this unique distinction of being oppressed and killed and lynched in Texas on our own soil. There is no Marcus Garvey Back to Africa movement for Mexicans. There's no Back to Mexico, because we're being oppressed on our own native soil, like Native Americans, right? I live in California, which up until 1850 was under different management, right? It belonged to Mexico. So that's it. But just because I see the victimization, I studied American history in college, and I understand the victimization, doesn't mean that I think of myself as a victim. And it also means that Mexican Americans are never, I promise you, they're never going to come forward and make a demand for reparations. They never are. They're not, it's not in our DNA to do that. And I think one reason is, from what I hear, we don't believe that there's a price to be put on this. we don't believe that there's a price that the state of California can give us to shut us up and buy us off, because there just isn't. We don't think that this can be made right in that way with a check.
Can I interject a couple of things?
That was the nature of the column.
Thanks, Ruben.
You bet. Thank you.
I think your point is very good. Yeah, the cost of all of this loss is incalculable. And if you could calculate it, it would go into the trillions. And that's beyond dispute. I think what's also beyond dispute is that the moral case for reparations is impeccable. In cases of all these groups, in the cases of the Japanese, in the cases of the Mexican Americans, in the cases of African Americans, the moral case for reparations is indisputable because the losses continue on to this day. The problem, there are two problems, is that one is the legal issue of damages, legal issues of damages and liability. Because inevitably, the question is going to become exactly who was directly damaged and exactly who is responsible. And that's when things begin to get very fuzzy. I mean, one thing that I think that the Jewish victims had in their favor, and also that the Japanese victims had in their favor, is that most of the victims, many of the victims were still alive. And they could very easily make the case that they had been damaged, by this, and they have been damaged. Certainly in the case of Japanese Americans and Japanese in America, directly by the government. It's a little bit harder to make that case, when you have an institution that ended over 150 years ago, and when there are no surviving people who can claim direct damages, and when the people who would be liable are claiming that they are not liable. The other point I want to make, is that one of the reasons that I think the measure passed in Evanston, which has been, lauded, nationwide, one of the reasons I think it passed is because they found a bucket of money they could conceivably tap into that had not existed before. And this was taxes on sales of marijuana. Inevitably, when you get into these issues, the question is going to come, okay, if you have reparations, where does the money come from to pay for it? Evanston came up with a non-zero sum solution, in essence. And again, I don't see I don't see Evanston's case not being challenged in Supreme Court or in federal court at some point. I think they are conservative groups just dying to challenge these cases, and they will. As payments begin to be made.
Can I weigh in from Evanston on this?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that it is true that the marijuana tax has a new tax, made it somewhat easier for us to find revenue in order to present the legatees with redress. But that's not really what happened in Evanston, that we just thought, oh, there's a new tax. And so there were years of sort of educational outreach within the community. We have a very progressive, highly educated populace. And the leaders of this movement, Judge Lionel Jean-Baptiste, Alderman Simmons, Braithwaite Rainey, they spent a couple of years directly engaged, raising the consciousness about the particular harms that were done through housing inequality and Jim Crow style redlining in our community. We also thought very carefully about making the program very targeted so that it would survive the legal challenges that you're talking about. And they're already forthcoming. Which is, and the real proof in the pudding there is that we've recently voted to open up new streams of revenue from old taxes. The housing transfer tax, for example, is going to be the next move to bring more funds into the program. So it's not just that there were, sort of an easy pot of money to sort of make available for these payments. I mean, there are some, frankly, that have argued that the cannabis tax is regressive and that you actually have, Black and working class people paying more for cannabis in Evanston that leads to them paying their own reparations, right? And I think there's a real argument to be made there. So it's a bit more complex than just there's a new tax. That's all I wanted to add.
Can I add in real quick? As far as I think the question was about police brutality and how that intersects with reparations. So what happened with Tyree Nichols, a Black American?
Let me introduce you all first too. Both these are from St. Paul, Minnesota, which has a reparations issue before it. And Professor Tillery he is leading a study of reparations developments in Evanston. And Brother Cruz here is founder of Black Lives Matter in Minnesota. And he is one of the members of the St. Paul City Council Reparations Legislative Advisory Committee. So, Brother Cruz, please continue.
So are we going to give out 3 minutes before we open up the discussions? I have a lot of points I wanted to jump in on.
You're gonna be next. You are next. You are next.
Okay.
Go ahead, Trey.
I'll keep this to 3 minutes. I was going to just say that, like California, here in St. Paul, we've adopted the 5 principles of reparations, and one of those principles is guarantees of non-repetition. But since police have killed George Floyd, in the United States, we repeatedly see police killing Black Americans. So when we talk about cessation or guarantees of non-repetition, that's an international standard of reparations. So reparations would be like guarantees of non-repetition when it comes to police killing Black Americans, or police racial profiling Black Americans, or racist housing discriminations, or racist education discriminations. Constantly, this repeat of discrimination, economic discrimination, continues to happen to Black Americans. So when we talk about it won't be hard to figure out, or the legalities of it, this is still happening. When you talk about loss of land, Black Americans have lost 90% of our land since 1910, or the Reconstruction period into 1997. Again, that's not something that happened 400 or 500 years ago. These are things that are still happening right now. So when we talk about reparations, we're talking about slavery, but we're also talking about Jim Crow. We're talking about the lynching period. We're talking about redlining and redistricting. We're talking about mass incarceration, and we're talking about police terror. So that's what the current reparations movement that has caught traction in the United States. That's what that is currently focused on right now.
Thank you, appreciate that. Okay, and Nkechi, and
Okay.
Richard, you seem to be fading in and out. Are you near?
Oh yeah, all right. I'm going to try to stay right here because this is where people can hear me. But I want to hear Nkechi, and we were talking beforehand, and I posed the question about whether the events in Memphis should be a part of the reparations discussion, and she said absolutely. So take it away, Nkechi. Tell us, that we want to keep on track here about what it is that journalists need to know about the whole reparations issue so they can write intelligent, well-informed stories.
Okay,
Or
so
broadcast them.
Yeah, I said absolutely. The Tyree Nichols murder is part of a reparations claim. Reparations is not limited to the enslavement era, but it includes the vestiges of enslavement and the living legacies that last down through to today. In COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, of which I am a founding member, Adjoa Toro, who's on the screen here, was head of the COBRA Litigation Strategies Commission committee. We came up with 5 injury areas for reparations, specifically to be able to survive that statute of limitations legal argument that always comes up. And we talked about wealth poverty. We talked about peoplehood, nationhood. We talked about health disparities, education disparities, mass incarceration, police brutality, and the like. I always say my mantra has always been the harms from the enslavement era and beyond were multifaceted. Thus, the remedies must be multifaceted as well. We're not talking about just a check. I'm not saying that monetary damages are not part of a legitimate reparations claim. I personally feel that they are. But again, the harms were so bad, they are not going to be remedied by just a chat. There are many different forms of which it can take. But I want to do my 3 minutes if I can, what I was going to do, if I may, because my brothers had their platform. But basically, I've been working on the issue of reparations since the early 70s, at a time when the topic was unpopular, when it was definitely on the fringes, when it wasn't fashionable, when one would be considered a militant, which I was, a revolutionary, which I was, or just plain crazy, which I was not. So it really gives me great pleasure today to be in the company of some of the leading minds on these issues. And so, when we talk about reparations, I've been on a quest for justice my entire life. I wrote a memoir about it, Black Power, Black Lawyer, My Audacious Quest for Justice. I delivered a riveting TEDx talk on the issue, reparations, an issue whose time has come. And I just last month published a book called Reparations on Fire, How and Why It's Spreading Across America. So this newest book basically describes history in the making, what folk have been talking about today. Evanston, Illinois, California, what's happening there? Reparations being debated in city councils and state houses across the country. I consider my book part historical analysis, part revolutionary manifesto, and part political red alert, bringing additional value to the issue as the reparations movement goes around its necessary task of concretizing its goals and objectives and envisioning just what Black freedom and joy and can look. My book describes how reparations went from being discussed in the radical margins of the civil rights movement. The brother earlier talked about James Foreman, who essentially interrupted Sunday service at Riverside Church and demanded that churches and synagogues give up reparations. And some religious institutions did in fact pay into that. To the Caribbean community, CARICOM, to the United Nations. I talk about unsung Black power activists whose feet I sat under, such as Queen Mother Audley Moore, Imari Abubakari Obadeli, people who set the foundations for the reparations conversation that's going on now, who set the foundation for John Conyers introducing the Commission to Study Reparation Proposals in 1989. We worked very closely with John Conyers in crafting that legislation. I just want to kind of conclude by saying, the quest for reparations is equal parts edgy, it's exciting, it's transformational, it's confrontational, it's messy, it's confusing. In my book, Reparations on Fire, I use that analogy because fire illuminates, it purifies, and it brings warmth, but it can also cause pain, damage, and destruction. It can symbolize the eternal flame of hope, or it can signify ruin or demise. The spirit of reparations is sweeping the country like fire, and whether it heals or whether it consumes depends on how America responds to this long overdue debt.
Richard, can I ask Nkechi a question there? We are tending to conflate two separate but very related legal issues. Reparations, which is one continuing movement, which against a continuing battle against crimes against humanity, against Black peoples, of which police terrorism is a most important component. While we pursue reparations for previous damages, we must continue to seek justice in criminal and civil courts, the judiciaries in other countries, including the UN and the International Court of Justice. In 1951, African Americans filed a UN petition entitled "We Charge Genocide." There's been a joint submission to the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination just last year by the Amnesty International, Global Justice Center, the Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative for Economic and Social Justice, and Human Rights Watch, basically making the same allegations. Reparations is distinct, I'm convinced, from this continuing pursuit of justice
Yes.
that we should pursue in the criminal courts, in the civil courts, and the international organizations, including the International Court of Justice. And at some points they will link and intersect, but they are two distinct.
Yeah, I don't think we're saying anything different. As you know, the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa designated the transatlantic slave trade and its vestiges as crimes against humanity. So we are definitely on the same wavelength. But we say that the reparations are not just for the enslavement era, but for its living legacies, and mass incarceration and police brutality is part of that living legacy. But that does not conflate with what we're doing in the courts, every day. So I agree with you. I don't think we're saying anything contrary.
I
just have to ask, Kenny, where are you with all the water and the trees and the sand?
Well, I'd like to be in the sand and at the beach right now. I don't know exactly what you
Oh,
mean.
no,
Part my reparation. No, go ahead, please tell me what's your question.
I'm in Southeast Washington next to the Navy Yard. And
Oh,
this is
where's he? Oh, I thought you were talking about.
backdrop.
I wasn't even looking at his back.
Backdrop that I can put on Zoom. As
Okay.
opposed
Oh,
to
okay.
immensely
Well, I
tricky.
want to just for clarity, because as I said, we're trying to get the facts so the journalists can write intelligent and well-informed stories. It's everybody agreed that reparations is really just about the past and not the present, not present injustices.
It is the vestiges from the past, the living legacies that have direct connection.
So it is about the present then.
I don't agree. I don't agree with that, Richard.
Okay.
You've got the 1876 Cruikshank decision
Yes.
from the U.S. Supreme Court, which said white people had a right to band together and murder blacks in order to preserve their way of life. And that launched a reign of terror by the Klan and others for the next 70 years. One can't just stop at the Civil War, where my grandfather was in the Pennsylvania Cavalry, and end it there and say reparations, that's all we have to deal with. It was a continuing process ratified by the Supreme Court and launched on generations of Black folks. And the Supreme Court's, the free reign of terror that the Klan and other of their ilk had didn't really end as such until the mid-60s. Now,
So what
Trump,
are you saying about whether reparations is for the past only or includes the present?
it includes the present. I mean, you had a Supreme Court decision that was never formally rejected, all right? But due to the civil rights struggles of the 60s, the free reign that the Klan had was largely gotten rid of, though if you look at the way the police treat some Black communities and the continuing murders of Blacks, it has never completely gone away. And so when you talk about justice, it doesn't stop with 65. It's the license to kill what the Supreme Court gave to groups of whites to kill us. And that hasn't stopped.
And again, if I can just jump in with guarantees of non-repetition is #1 principle of reparations from the UN, and that's under international law. A state responsible for wrongfully injuring a people is under an obligation to cease the act if it's continuing. So the United States continues to kill Black people, and B, offer appropriate assurances and guarantees of non-repetition. So that hasn't happened yet. We have the George Floyd Policing Act. We have the Breonna Taylor Act. We have a lot of acts, but none of them are being adopted, and the police continue to kill us. So
That's one of the ways reparations is distinct from the pursuit of justice for crimes against humanity. There are criminal and civil penalties associated with those. Those are still active cases. And we can have even more active cases if we pursue them as crimes that need to be prosecuted today. This chap they've just hired to be the special counsel for Trump, he's over in Europe prosecuting war criminals in Eastern Europe. These are current, in some cases, continuing crimes. And that's what we're talking about here. Continuing crimes against humanity, of which the police terrorism of Black people is a significant portion.
I wanted to jump in if I could.
Well, I wanted to call on you anyway, Rachel.
Okay.
Because, let me just make sure I've got the right introduction. Yeah, Rachel is a journalist, author, and journalism professor at NYU, and spent a lot of time at the New York Times, I'll add. In 2016, she broke the story about Georgetown University's relationship to slavery, which we had a roundtable on, as a matter of fact, and that was for the Times. Her forthcoming book, The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church, is going to be published by Random House in June. Now, Rachel, 3 minutes.
So I thought it'd be interesting to talk. A lot of the discussion has been about how reparations is playing out in municipalities, cities, states around the country. What I've been looking at is institutions and how institutions have been grappling with reparations, particularly faith institutions. And what's interesting too, in light of kind of the discussion we've been having, is that they're taking a number of different approaches in terms of both kind of, the historical harm that they're hoping to address, and also the remedy that they're proposing. Georgetown University established, first Catholic university established in the United States, born out of and funded by slave labor, even long before there was a sale. And they have a program which just belatedly got started. You may remember that students in some ways actually prodded them a bit to move, where a majority of students at Georgetown said they wanted to tax themselves with a fee so that Georgetown would do something for its the descendants of the people who were sold and enslaved to keep the college afloat. What Georgetown did instead was to promise to raise $400,000 a year. This is the first year. They were delayed by COVID and other things. And they are basically funding individuals and organizations that want to do work that would benefit the descendant community. So it's not quite cutting a check to an individual. In fact, it's not. But it's, if you wanted to build a clinic that would serve a community where a large number of descendants live, or if you wanted to do educational programming, they're funding that kind. Well, we're going to see, actually. They had the first round of applications come in, and I think they're supposed to be doing 2 rounds, so we should be hearing soon. The Catholic Church, the Jesuit Order of Priests, has promised to raise $100 million to atone for its role in the American slave trade. It's the largest effort that the Catholic Church has made to try to make amends for this history. But they are really struggling, though, to raise the money, which is an interesting thing. Some people say, why are they even struggling? Why are they trying to raise money? Because the Catholic Church has plenty of money. So there's been that argument, too. But they, even within their ranks, even though they came to an agreement with descendants about, or some descendants, about a program in which they would do this. And a portion of that was going to be money to directly support elderly and infirm descendants. Within the Jesuit order and even among descendants, there's some disagreement. The third example I want to highlight for you is the Virginia Theological Seminary, an Episcopal seminary, which benefited from the slave trade, but also they talk about Jim Crow and about the fact that students couldn't go, and also how they treated the workers who worked for them. And this institution is actually giving checks. They decided that's what we're going to do. And they're giving checks to people who have ties not only to the slave era, but to the Jim Crow era. And they started about 2 years ago I think it was Ruben who said, how much. There is no way to kind of quantify this, or to make it meaningful to kind of the harm. They say that's true. On the other hand, to say that you can't do anything means that you won't do anything. So they basically said, well, we're going to say up front, this doesn't atone, but it's what we can do. And so they are literally cutting checks for family, smallish checks, $2,100 a year, roughly, and I think it depends on their endowment, in perpetuity. So there's a lot of experimentation, thinking, arguing about how this should play out. But I think it's interesting that some of these institutions, faith-based institutions, and they were among the earliest. This was, I mean, Virginia Theological Seminary announced in 2019, and Georgetown did too. So they were among the earlier ones to kind of get this going.
Thank you, Rachel. Now we heard from a couple of folks from St. Paul, but let's hear from Katie Galioto of the Star Tribune, who can give us the journalist's take on what's happening there in St. Paul. Where do we stand, and what should we all know about the situation there?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Katie. It's been really interesting hearing everyone talk because I feel like I have been seeing this, covering this topic, I guess, in a very narrow sort of St. Paul local sort of perspective. And I guess if this sounds good, Richard, I can just give you the quick sort of where St. Paul's at as almost like an interesting policy case study. Because I'm guessing you invited me to speak here because St. Paul's just sort of at an interesting moment in its conversations about reparations. And I'll give you my quick spiel about, I guess, sort of where they are and what I've been covering lately. Like many cities across the United States, the St. Paul City Council formally apologized for its role in institutional racism in 2021. And there are members of the Legislative Advisory Committee on Reparations like Trey Hearn who can talk much more and much better about sort of the movement in St. Paul that it took to even get to that point. But since then, about a month ago, the St. Paul City Council voted to create a permanent 11-person commission that's going to advise city leaders on budget and policy decisions related to reparations. And they're just about to start accepting applications for people who want to serve on that commission. And I think that group's going to have a lot to figure out. One really interesting thing I've noticed from my reporting, and I think one of the first things this commission is going to have to dive into is that the word reparations means very different things to very different people in the community. Of course, some people are talking about direct cash payments to all Black descendants of slaves. Another thing that comes up in every conversation in St. Paul is the Rondo neighborhood, which for those of you who aren't familiar with Minnesota, St. Paul had a historically Black community called Rondo that was sort of torn into when a federal highway was built in the 1950s and 1960s, and something like 600 or 700 families lost their homes, businesses. And the mayor of St. Paul, Melvin Carter, he's the city's first Black mayor, and his father and grandfather actually grew up in Rondo. He is about to launch a program called the Inheritance Fund that would create a forgivable loan program for people who had property that was taken away in the Rondo neighborhood. And those loans could be used for down payment assistance or housing rehabs, and they could be up to $100,000 depending on whether some people meet some certain income requirements. But
Can I interrupt for just a second? Isn't the Rondo neighborhood one of the communities where the state or the officials put a road or a highway through, and therefore depress the property values and the community cohesion and all that, and it's cited often as an example of environmental racism. Am I correct about that?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. And like I think something similar happened in a few other cities, but this is like one of the examples I see in all the articles about like highway racism. Yeah. But so the mayor has this sort of loan program that's about to launch. But something I think that's really interesting is he has really been intentionally trying to distinguish this program from reparations. The Rondo community, he says, lost $100 million in generational wealth when this freeway was built. He sort of told me recently in an interview that like, I'm not using the word reparations because what we're doing is nowhere near a $100 million repayment. And his focus is starting to like rebuild some of these inheritances that were lost. So I guess the treatment of the term relates to sort of the critique of Evanston's program that was in Ellis's background sheet. Does it harm the national reparations movement to use the word reparations to describe more like narrow, localized policies or programs aimed at addressing historic wrongdoings? There are certainly former like Rondo residents who I've interviewed who, you know, are calling this inheritance fund program reparations, even though the mayor doesn't want to call it reparations. So I think there's just this sort of nuanced language conversation that's already happening and will continue to happen in St. Paul. That I guess I'm here to cover. And yeah, curious to hear.
I think that's really the thing about the term is really interesting, because you have people who are really embracing it and you know, some institutions who are really running from it, you know, like Georgetown will not ever say that it's reparations, it's a reconciliation fund. And the Jesuits as well. I think the Virginia Theological Seminary would say that it was reparations, but I think for some white institutions that are trying to find their way, both to kind of address the wrongs, but also to mollify stakeholders, you know, within their institutions or alums, it's a tricky road for them.
Okay, all right. I see. Well, does anyone else from St. Paul want to weigh in on clarifying or adding to what Katie just said?
I would just, when we talk about the use of the word, or going back to what the international standards is, number 4 is satisfaction. So satisfaction is part of full reparations under international law for moral damage, such as emotional injury, mental suffering, and injury to reputation. In some instances where cessation, restitution, and compensation do not bring full repair, satisfaction is also needed. So apologies fall under reparative category satisfaction also. But so just when you're saying, like, when we talk about reparations, is and we don't, the St. Paul Recovery Act right now, we don't want to call the inheritance fund program reparations either. It's a housing program, and I think that's good. Anytime you can give low income people housing, that's great. But everybody who lost housing in Rondo was not low income. Some of the businesses in Rondo were not low income people, and some of them people still went on to live a successful life and contribute to the city of St. Paul, but they're owed a debt for that because of what happened to them. So just because somebody's not low income doesn't mean that they're not owed reparations. When we're using words like loans, you can't, if I owe you, I can't loan you the money I owe you, or I can't say, oh, I owe you, I'm gonna give you a loan, but it's low interest. So those are some of the things that I think when we talk about words or things like that, when you're taught, you might say grants, you know, when we start, that's a different, so I think, yeah, the wording that we use when we're talking about reparations, especially around housing, is going to be really important. And then the people that you're talking about, houses in America, the average house costs $300,000 or $400,000. Then we have to look at the average American whose ancestors descend from slavery. What's their median income, or what's their income level? What's their credit score? So there's just a lot of issues that are going to have to take place before we start. Just the wording is very important.
So Richard, I just want to say, if I may, we are really engaged in what I call history in the making right now. There are no just history in the making. That's why these issues dealing with definitions and words, this is all very new in terms of concreteness with respect to reparations. My colleague is talking about the international law. International law is recent too. And one of the problems that I have, and I'm a civil and human rights lawyer, is that they're not using our specific case studies as they're coming up with these definitions. The part dealing with full reparations that deals with those 5 principles: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, guarantees of non-repetition. They're not talking about the descendants. They're talking about the actual victims and maybe the family members, but they don't go back generations like our situation does. What I think we need to do is start coming up with our definitions and requiring the international community to take it up. And since you're journalists, and Richard, you said, how can we provide some guidance? A definition that I've been using for reparations is that reparations are forms of redress provided to those who have suffered human rights abuses or other forms of widespread systemic injustices, or to their descendants, usually in the aftermath of war, enslavement, or other forms of gross injustice. And in our specific context, the context of Black people in America, I submit that reparations constitutes 4 elements. Number 1, the formal acknowledgement of historic wrong in an official, unfettered apology. Why do I say unfettered? Because the House and Senate both passed apology bills, but the Senate bill said, you cannot use our apology to justify any type of reparations. Number 2, the recognition that the injury has continued past the enslavement era and still manifests today. Number 3, the commitment to redress by the culpable parties, including the federal government, which sanctioned the enslavement and its vestiges and living legacies, and by state and local governments, academic and religious institutions, industries and corporate entities, private estates, and more, who enjoyed unjust enrichment. And number 4, the actual redress in whatever form or forms are agreed upon. And I say are agreed upon because it's not reparations. If the culpable party says, this is what it's going to be, your name on the building, that's your reparation. Okay, your scholarship here, that's your no, it has to be something that the victimized party, the injured party themselves agree. And no, it's not a full reparation. It is a negotiated settlement, which is a legal we are settling. We're not saying that this is going to fully and forever compensate for the ma'afa, the gross injustices, but this is a settlement. So anyway, thank you.
Okay, is there anything you can put in the chat that would summarize?
It's in my book. I put my I put the link to my book, Reparations on Fire.
Okay.
How why it's spreading across America.
Okay, very good. Now, Minho, I want to just ask you, since you did a survey of what's happening around the country for Politico, is there anything that we need to be aware of that we haven't talked about yet?
Not too sure. I was just here to give it a year and listen. But I think I would definitely think that the internment case, the reparations case with Japanese internment is an interesting case for me, because how they pushed forward in the federal level back in the 70s is starting from actually coming up with a congressional committee. People here probably all know about that, but that was the biggest takeaway for me doing that story, is that making that political opening at the very beginning in the federal level by pushing forward a committee was just a very, I guess, was a smart approach in the 70s, and that's how it worked out. And I guess right now that's a local push. I think.
Well, no, Congress has HR 40.
Right. That's not right now. I totally get that, but it's not politically tenable at the moment, so it's not going anywhere in the Congress level. But I'm saying what the congressional committee in the 70s can be comparable to local movements, so that it's making some political openings at a local level, so that in the years to come there might be more discussions moving forward in the federal level. So I guess that's what I was getting at, making that.
Oh, interesting. Okay. All right, that's good. John Funabiki, you're out there in California. Do you have anything to add? We mentioned some of the Japanese American response to this African American movement earlier, and there was some discussion about that. But is there anything you want to clarify about that we need to know or could take away from what you've seen?
I think that, well, first of all, this has been absolutely terrific, and I'm learning an awful lot. Oftentimes the Japanese American redress movement is cited as an example of how this could happen. But I take to heart Ellis's point that there's a couple distinct things. One, they were pointing to a single action, right? The incarceration of Japanese Americans during the war, which was very definable, and you could point to as a single act of injustice, as opposed to the much broader and much deeper ongoing injustices against Black Americans in the United States. And two, that the reparations were limited to those living descendants of the incarceration. So those two make it a lot easier to identify politically and to make the case politically compared to kind of the broader issues that we're discussing in this conversation. That's point one. Point two I would make is that because of the incarceration, many Japanese Americans, not all, but many, certainly all of the ones that I know, endorse reparations for slavery and endorse political, social justice, and criminal justice reforms that have affected African Americans. And in addition, politically and philosophically draw direct connections between what happened to Japanese Americans and what have happened to African Americans, indigenous communities, Mexican Americans, immigrants, and refugees. Many of the protests that were held at the border about the incarceration of children were led by Japanese Americans who were children in the concentration camps during World War II. So there's these very strong connections within the Japanese American community to the question and issues of reparations for African Americans. The other thing I would just like to note is that I've learned so much by just listening to this conversation, and I can really see the need for some guidelines for journalists about how to cover this. And I just messaged Ellis to send me his background paper, which I did not see before today. But having something that journalists can use to help guide them as they cover these issues and see the differences between the way people are using the term and using other terms, whether it's reparations, reconciliation. These are totally different things, right? Social justice reforms, totally criminal justice reforms. These are all very separate things, and we are tending to glom them all together as we cover this issue. So those are some of the points I would make right now.
Well,
Thank you.
good.
Can I just underscore that and say something else?
Yes.
I think that, yeah, I agree with everything that was just said. I mean, I do also want to say that I think the overall political context is really important, right? So Ms. Taifa, whom I've seen in Evanston quite a bit with all of her dynamic work, sort of pointed out the limitations of the congressional apologies that happened in 2008 and 2009, which they took on voice vote, so they wouldn't even have a record of who voted in favor of the apology in the Senate, right? And so that's a conservative context. The Civil Rights Act of 1988, which paid out the reparations for Japanese Americans, it was a different time politically. Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition stated, very aggressive support for, reparations for Japanese Americans. Let's also not forget the work in the Senate side, Senator Inoue and Akaka, who'd been war heroes themselves, right, had the power, to help shepherd that through the most conservative House of Congress. So the point I'm making here is that, Mr. Funabiki's raising this idea about coalition, right? And that might ultimately be the most important thing for keeping this movement vibrant, and the targeting, right? I mean, it's very clear, Evanston's ordinance is not reparative of slavery because slavery was not the issue in Evanston. Jim Crow style segregation from 1919 to 1968 was the issue, 69 rather. And so, to talk reparations for slavery in Evanston just didn't make any sense, right? But reparations for Jim Crow being able to craft solutions based on all of these contexts and know that it's all working to the same end, which is repairing harm and promoting greater racial equity. I mean, I think that is almost more important than getting the precise meaning down. I mean, I just don't buy these arguments that what's happening in Evanston or St. Paul or California is going to be bad for an overall movement for reparations for slavery. Like, where is that movement? Like, where is that happening? Like, when is that happening? Right? Like, I say we've got to keep chipping away at all of these sort of solutions all at the same time, just like they did in '88. And that's why they got something. It was paltry, $25,000. When the houses in 1988 were valued at like 250,000, the houses and land that was, so they got like 10% of what they probably were owed in current market rates. And then they never even paid out most of the money because they stalled it out and waited for people to die, right? But like, it still was an important chip that we can build on. And so I think that's the kind of flexible thinking we've got to have as we move this movement forward today.
Oh, thank you. Joe Geisler has a question for John about terminology. Joe, what's your question to John?
Actually, John and Nichelle, I have recently learned about the importance of the word internment having very likely been created by the people who were incarcerating people or detaining people. And it's a sanitized word. And I noted that John was using incarcerated, and Nichelle also pointed out her students said detained. And I think that is just so important to think about in the language constructs, how we can even clean things up, tidy things up by language itself.
Thank
So
you,
John,
Joe.
what do you
Actually,
say?
my aunt would called it a prison.
Okay. So we should say imprisonment then. All right. Okay, we have a.
Yes. I just want to say that I learned from my Japanese American colleagues who part of the Nikkei progressives and the Nikkei movement for redress that they do in fact prefer incarceration. And exactly as my colleague just said, that internment is not the and then they gave a specific reason as to why it wasn't. I forgot just what it was now, but it was incarceration. And I also learned that the inspiration for the Japanese American Redress Bill, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that granted reparations to Japanese Americans, was the civil rights and Black Power movement, that our movement was the inspiration for their movement. So we have been working very closely together. They have been, they just submitted a letter with just hundreds of signatures in support of our reparations, in support of HR 40 and the like. So we are working in tandem, hand in hand.
Can I
All
bring
right,
up
Rochelle
one
Riley
more
has
point about that?
Thank you very much, Richard. I raised my hand because there's so many great questions in the chat. I don't know if we're going to get to them, but what I wanted to hear from several of the panelists, and especially Ellis, Cose, we spend a lot of time talking about reparations for something past by talking about enslavement, but the centuries of mistreatment and terror and discrimination and everything after that deserves attention too. Should we change the focus of what we're talking about, because it's a continuing tragedy, a continuing, I'm at a loss for words right now.
Well, it is a tragedy.
Yes.
Yeah,
But the tragic circumstances are not past, they are continuing. So what has happened is we have spent literally centuries teaching the American myth of America without dealing with slaves. So the farther we put it into the past, the easier it is to not treat it like Japanese imprisonment or something else. It's this old thing that let's get over it. But if we are literally talking about the continuing mistreatment of African Americans, both legally and illegally, does that change the conversation at all? So I just wanted the panelists to talk about that a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that any logical person looking at the history of the United States does not end the era of slavery in 1865. There were direct descendants, to slavery. After the Reconstruction era, we essentially just entered another form of slavery, And so from my perspective, I think any view of reparations that's logical and consistent looks at both the enslavement era, looks at Jim Crow, and looks at the whole era that included the presumption that people of African descent were not entitled to full rights. I do agree with my brother Kenneth that there's a distinction between ongoing crimes against humanity and things like the shooting of Tillery, which represents something horrible, but I wouldn't put those under the rubric of reparations. And I think those can also be dealt with and will be dealt with, I'm sure, by damages in current law. So I think when we're talking about reparations, we're talking about systemic issues that have affected us economically and otherwise, which originated in the era of slavery, but continued beyond that.
There are also, Ellis, systemic issues of crimes against humanity. These are crimes. These are crimes that we and others have alleged in the proper international forum, in the UN and the International Court of Justice, where evidence must be taken, judgment must be determined, justice must be served, people must be found guilty or not on these crimes. And so
I thank you both. That's exactly the phrase I was looking for, crimes against humanity. So thank you.
Yeah. I don't think we're disagreeing, Kenneth.
Okay, no, I don't either. I just wanted to expand on that point, that that's really how we get into the difference between reparations and crimes against humanity. Reparations, for the most part, deals with things that have happened that people want to make restorative justice toward. Continuing crimes against humanity is a separate matter that needs to be pursued equally vigorously.
But I will say that they're very much related, because the same view of certain people that allowed the enslavement and that allowed Jim Crow, et cetera, also allow in America police to act with impunity in certain communities. So they are certainly related.
For sure.
And I think it underscores again. I mean, one of the points that I made in my little paper, and Richard, I should say, was pushing me to write more. And I said, Richard, I ain't got the time, man. I'll write you a page and a half. Because there's a lot that can be said on this issue, and I'm happy to sort of address that at some point. But I think that what all of this also underscores is the importance of history when we have a crisis going on under this current in Republican Party that basically wants to erase much of history. And in erasing much of history will erase much of the reality that has given rise to the circumstances we now have.
Also, I just want to say that I think that one of our problems is that we don't look at issues and have it relate to us, even though it's stark in our face that it relates to us. But we always have excuses. I'm just going to use someone earlier, one of my panelists brought up the issue of genocide. And the international definition of genocide, which has been codified in the US Code, is number one, killing members of a group. Number two, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Number three, deliberately inflicting upon the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction in whole or in part. And number four, taking measures to prevent births within a group. Yet we don't use this definition, which is not just the mass extinction of the native peoples or the baking of the Jews in the ovens. It covers exactly what we're talking about here. And the definition that goes on that's in the US Code continues to say, genocide is not the only actionable crime. Conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, intent to commit genocide, and complicity in its commission. And it goes on to say that those guilty of genocide shall be punished, regardless of whether they are constitutionally elected rulers public officials or private citizens. So that definition squarely fits ourselves, but we journalists, the media, academicians, scholars, never want to equate what is there in writing with our particular situation, and that must change.
Okay.
I agree with that. I mean, I think there's a ton, so, you know, the slavery piece, I mean, you know, to go back to the issue of standing, right? And the fact that, you know, that's one way in which the courts try to knock down claims. I mean, even if we look at, you know, my alma mater, Harvard, which now has a Black woman president whom I was in school with, right? If we look at the claims where they were the families of the persons that Louis Agassiz had photographed as slaves, and they wanted the daguerreotype photographs back, right? And Harvard says, no, you can't have them back, right? And so we're adjudicating these kinds of cases on an individual basis. But, you know, what Ms. Taifa is saying, I think there's very clear evidence in the Jim Crow era, right? We know the states that expelled, say, Black boys from school in the 4th and 5th grade because they wouldn't fund them anymore. We know the names of those persons. They're still alive, right? We know the names of the persons who were rejected from places like University of Mississippi and Alabama, right? We have the records. That class. It's easier to walk backwards, starting with the Jim Crow and then moving back in time. But all of that to me looks like a class of persons that's eligible for the kinds of, you know, claims that Ms. Taifa's raising, but like, I don't see the cases. I don't see the cases moving forward. And that's been something that's puzzled me for 20 years, right? So
I know there was a case that what led John Conyers to start introducing HR 40 was that, and I don't have all of it correct, but I know that the judge said it needs to be handled legislatively. So that's what I think is why people are pushing through legislation. And then just Rosewood was the first municipal level reparations that happened in America. And then going back to something Ms. Swarns were saying and something you were also saying, Mr. Tillery, is public and private. I don't think reparations should be at the federal level. It needs to be at the public. It needs to be at the private level, but it also needs to be at the local government, private institutions, banks, insurance companies. If we look at other groups like our Jewish American brothers and sisters, some of us have been able to work with them with the claims conference and things like that. But just recently, I think they sued a train company that gave a ride to Auschwitz. So no one's exempt or nobody's off the table. And I think we should follow that example too. If somebody was involved in slavery, especially in port cities like in the South or on the East Coast where slaves were actually being brought off. But the way people are saying, like, are we going to do it just for slavery or after slavery? It's not either or, it's both, because it never stops. So it's an ongoing crime. Then we say it's a crime against humanity, whether it's a crime or not, the crime is still ongoing. So going back to number one is stopping the crime. Then once the crime, then we can start assessing how much the damages are. But first we have to just stop the crime. So even here, our former chief of police, Todd Axel, said Black Americans are 4 times more likely to be pulled over by our white counterparts. Now that we have a commission, we can say, well, how much economically does a traffic stop cost a Black American in St. Paul? How much does mass incarceration cost us? And what type of remedies should we come through? We have a permanent commission that's going to be looking at the budget in 2024, 2025, 2026, 2027. Our state of Minnesota has a $20 billion surplus, but we have the 3rd biggest racial wealth gap in the country, the 3rd biggest education gap in the country, but we have the biggest surplus, but the biggest racial wealth gap too. So I think some of the models we're setting up here are and can be used as models across the country as it starts to roll out more.
So
I want
I-
to jump
I
in.
agree
I want
with
to
that.
jump in just for a second, if I could, just
Yes,
to
go ahead.
kind of pivot off what you were saying, which is that, and to what Rochelle's question was, of course, I agree like everyone does that it's not either or. But I would say, just to your point, Rochelle, that I think that a lot of people, when we look back at, the idea of reparations for slavery, it's so long ago, who are those people? It's so difficult. But the point that you were just making is important, because what I'm doing a lot of these days is looking at, slavery and contemporary institutions. There are beneficiaries that, I mean, it's not, they're around us, all around us right now today. And the records are there. The records exist. One of the reasons why the Georgetown case was so compelling was because the Jesuits kept the record. I mean, it's very clear who the harm happened to and who the descendants are today. And Georgetown is not unique, banks, insurance, I mean, the records are there. So I think that and the beneficiaries are all around us. So I think sometimes, especially like Ellis was talking about in our efforts, the efforts to say, oh, so long ago, who cares, nothing to do with us. It has a lot to do with us. And I think, a lot to do with, some of the very wealthy corporations around us that benefited from that history.
And one last thing.
Let me just say this if I could, and I thank you so much for that, Rachel. When I was when I was a young reporter at the Post and went home to North Carolina to visit my grandfather, who would never talk about the generations before him, because of course it was an embarrassment. It was this horrible thing that they went through and they didn't want to discuss it. But he gave me enough information. So I went and found my great-great-grandfather in the North Carolina archives in the will of this attorney named W.S. Pitt. And he was listed as property with the amount that, and so I wanted to go and find that family. And I didn't, because I don't know what I would have done, but you're right, that those records are there. They are not there where we would typically look for them. But the day I found my ancestor in those records as somebody's property, let me know that, yes, he's still owed. There's still an invoice there. So thank you for that.
And I would say, for those who can discover that, absolutely do that. I mean, we need to close gaps and things along those lines. But I fervently believe that that should not be a requisite to qualify or to be eligible for reparations. I mean, because of the length of time, because of the obfuscation, because of the fact that a lot of times Blacks were fleeing the South, they were fleeing the Ku Klux Klan, they were changing their name, they didn't want to be found. The inadequate records keeping that's kept. I think that if folk can do that, they should. But I fervently believe it should not be a requisite.
Can I add again? And again, I'm more of an all at the same time, but also recognizing the whom we're fighting against, right? And so the records, and I carry the name Tillery. The Tillerys were really successful slavers that owned a good deal of southeastern North Carolina, right? It's Tillery, North Carolina. They've got these 5 huge plantations. So we can go back to the record and I can see very clearly my first African ancestor coming from Jamaica in 1728. So all of that I could do, right? But that is a lot harder under the law because all of those abuses were deemed legal, right, at the time. So we're fighting against that. But you come to the Jim Crow era, we have actual, constitutional jurisprudence on 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. All of that sort of post-war, post-Reconstruction, all of those abuses, there's much stronger standing. And then on top of it, there's a ton of social scientific evidence that what really explodes inequality for Black people in America is the Jim Crow era, right? And we have records on all of the things that, Ms. Swarns is talking about, like home loans to veterans and, the housing to destroy. So all of that is so well documented. It's just, that is an easier place to start. Doesn't mean it's more morally legitimate but it's just such an obvious place to start. And then walking back from there, you know, that can be done for some people. Absolutely. Right.
And I want to clarify and say that I certainly wasn't suggesting that, you know, the burden should be put, you know, on, you know, individuals, you know, to go find, you know, like it's, you know, this to find your, you know, like that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is in terms of, you know, the distance between the harm and like the invisible beneficiaries, that the beneficiaries aren't actually invisible at all.
No, exactly.
They're all around us, and the documentation of that is around us. So I certainly don't want to suggest.
I didn't think you were. I guess what I'm saying is, like, if I were to go into court to sue,
yes, and you're right,
wherever the white Tilleries are with all their wealth,
yep,
right? Some court in North Carolina would say, well, what's your connection to these people, right? And then I would have to go and do that. However, if I were to go and say, you know, here are the times my grandfather applied for a VA loan and was denied because of the racist, you know, person running that office in Newport News, Virginia, that's an easier lift because the documents are there. And guess what? Racial discrimination was actually unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause in the 20th century, right? And so that's a lot of how Evanston's program, that's part of what informed it, is the kind of context that we would be able to have success with, right?
So if I could jump in.
It's certainly the more recent it is, the easier it is, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
If I could jump in just very quickly, I've been listening very carefully to everything that was said. Overall, there's this current about how journalists should cover this issue, right? What advice can we give them? I think thank you, Richard. So I think what you always have to keep in mind is critical thinking. The most important thing we have going for us as journalists, I've been doing this over 35 years, is critical thinking critically about things, being able to ask these questions. And I think as you look through the reparations issue, there should be lots of questions, and even questions that reporters are asking themselves. We've talked about them here, I've taken notes. The questions, what are reparations? You know, what terms should we use? How do you define reparations? Why are reparations in place? To compensate or to punish, to acknowledge the past or somehow rectify the present? Who should be covered? We talked about that in California. If you're a African-American family in California that goes back 4 generations, and you can show direct oppression by the state of California, who stole your land and then profited from it, should you not be more deserving of direct reparations than somebody who is from African-American from Georgia, who just moved to California last month? Is that conversation worth having? If you broaden it out and you bring in more African-Americans, does that dilute the amount of money that goes to the native Californian African-American? I don't have an answer to that. These are the kinds of questions people should ask. And then also and this is sort of a bigger question, who needs to support this effort? Because in listening to this conversation, I had sort of flashback to the kind of conversations I have with friends of mine who are Latino, Mexican Americans, particularly those who went to like the Raza Unida party, those who from the 60s and 70s and 80s, who talk about the Southwest and reclaiming the Southwest, right? And I love my friends, but the longer they go, sometimes they kind of leave, you know, they leave what's practical, what's going to happen, right? God bless them. And when they could have sort of a bird in the hand, they're going for this, you know, broader thing that's never going to materialize. So my question is who do you need to support this? Is it important or not important that non-Blacks support this? Do you have to get buy-in from Latinos, who are now 20% of the population, more than African Americans, in fact? Do you have to get buy-in from Asian Americans? Do you have to get buy-in from white people? If you don't, then don't worry about it. But if you do, then it would help a lot to be able to focus the discussion. I don't mean our discussion, I mean the national discussion. Focus the discussion and really be definitive and clearly define exactly what you're due, what you think should come in form of compensation, rather than overreaching. And I think that the problem or the enemy of the reparation movement is 3 things. It's confusion, right? You want to make it as clear as possible. It's complexity, and it's conflation. It's when you're moving things together, conflating things that shouldn't be conflated. So I do think that we're in a very interesting position where there will be some money coming from the state of California to some African Americans in the state of California, a real check. But the question then becomes, who should get it? How much should it be? Do you need buy-in from other places and other groups? And if it goes too far, and all of a sudden we're talking about bigger issues, you're going to get pushback. They're going to be sued, big lawsuits. You go to court, things will get tied up. One last little wrinkle here. One of the things on the wish list for California is homelessness. They say, the commission says that California should pay reparations because African Americans have been hurt disproportionately by homelessness. I agree. I think we can all agree. But should the check for homelessness then go to African Americans who own homes? Big homes? Or should it go to African Americans who are homeless? And there's nothing wrong with journalists asking those questions.
So let me just say, if I may, and you threw a lot out there, so thank you so very much for that. We need more of this, Richard Prince. I'm really serious. One of the things we need to understand is that this issue has just gained saliency in the past couple of years since the murder of George Floyd. I've been working on this issue since I was 16 years old, and I'm 68 years old now. But it's only gained saliency within the mainstream. So it's like,
I was going to say, you are not 68 years old. You do not look 68 years old.
I mean, a woman is never supposed to tell
Don't
us
believe
not
it.
to say that, but I am.
I don't believe it.
But be nice and make those are excellent questions. I feel that where there are individual claims like Bruce's Beach or Rosewood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Africatown in Alabama with the slave ship Clotilda, of the Chattahoochee Brick Company, Elaine, Arkansas, those claims should be followed, okay? Should be dealt with in the courts or the legislature, whatever. But the reason why, and this goes back to something someone else said earlier about John Conyers, the reason why, two reasons why Conyers went the legislative route. Number one, like you said, the courts were saying it's a political question. Besides statute of limitations and laches and all that, it's a political question to be handled by the legislator. But even more importantly, it was seeing what was happening in 1988 with the reparations in our lifetime that was given to the Japanese Americans.
Yeah.
Conyers said, and we agree, look, if they could do it for the Japanese Americans, surely if we followed the same route that the Japanese Americans took, that was legislation calling for a commission to study the issue and make recommendations, they surely should be able to do it for us. Well, that was over 30 years ago. And it was a commission to study reparation proposals, later known as HR 40. But then a couple of years ago, when just before Conyers retired, we said, we studied this issue enough. You had Randall Robinson, you had Ta-Nehisi Coates, everyone, Ray Wimbush. I mean, everybody was writing about it, talking about it, et cetera, et cetera. We said it's time to add to that legislation, commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. So now it's together to study and develop proposals. And what happened in California, what California did was simply take the federal HR 40, S40 bill and incorporated it into their legislation with various nuances here and there. So it was the federal bill taken to the state, taken to the state level. And the last thing I'm gonna say is the legislative route, the political route, to me, is more viable for this longstanding issue that has spanned generations. Wasn't our fault that it's gone on so long. They didn't give it to us before. At the end of the Civil War, they gave reparations. They gave reparations. They gave it to white folk. The DC Compensated Emancipation Act gave reparations to the former white slaveholders for the loss of their so-called property, us. Nothing was given to us, as the brother said before. General Sherman, in meeting with those Black ministers, ministers said, we want land. And when the question is, well, do you want to stay with us, with the white folk and whip together? They say, no, we want to be off to ourselves with this land. And none of that happened or manifested. So I'm just saying the political process should be a way in which to overcome some of these hurdles, Brother Navarrete, that you were raising, and we should not just restrict ourselves within the boundaries of what today's law calls for. Yesterday's law said, Dred Scott, a Black person in America had no rights which a white person was bound to respect. Okay, that was changed, even though it's still there in effect. So we need to be forward thinking. We need to come up with new definitions, and we need to make this happen in our lifetime.
I want to echo what she's saying too. I mean, just having this discussion, you mentioned Durban, and I think, Ken, you were with me too. Were you at Durban? I forget. But if you were back in Durban when this, I mean, just to think about how this discussion here, that we're arguing about what form of reparations that is actually happening right now in some capacity is a better form. I mean, when Virginia Theological Seminary announced in 2019 that they were establishing a $1.7 million reparations fund, to look back at slavery, and it just seemed like I never imagined I would see it. I never imagined I would see it. And it is unfolding in all kinds of ways. And as you said, it's messy, but I also agree too with Nichelle saying in the chat too, like I want to be careful too about saying it's got to be this. I don't know that it's got to be this. I think this moment that we're in, where institutions, municipalities, universities, all kinds of people are wrestling with a recognition that this history needs to be addressed and actually taking action on the ground. As a journalist and as a Black woman, I'm interested and fascinated. I think it should unfold.
Okay, we've got to move on to our introductions. Somebody brought up, I mentioned Native Americans earlier in the conversation about how they too want their own form of reparations. And I'll put in the chat some articles about that, since there's no one to really articulate that the way a Native American could. And also, I think I mentioned in one of my last messages that the whole issue of African Americans and reparations is nuanced. Not everybody's on the same page. We titled this Who'll Pay Reparations for My Soul, and that was taken from Gil Scott-Heron's song, which we'll play later probably, but also from a book by Jesse McCarthy, who argues that this should not be reduced to dollars and cents, and it really, in order to make full redress, there's got to be a lot of structural change, and that's more important than money, he says. And then up in Boston, which also passed something on reparations, the publisher of the Bay State Banner wrote his own editorial saying that he was insulted by the whole concept because it implies that Blacks have not made progress on their own. So there are lots of views, and also, as we mentioned in the Pew Research study, not just Blacks and whites have views on reparations, but Asian Americans and Latinos also have their views. So it's a big subject. All right, and not to mention what's going on internationally, which we don't have time to get into. But anyway, it's time for our introductions. We want everybody to know who is here. So briefly, just tell us who you are. We're going to start with Adoja, who's on first person they say on my screen. Adoja, unmute please and tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Ajua Ayatollah.
Ajua, sorry.
It's okay. I'm one of the founding members of NCOBRA, the first woman co-chair of NCOBRA, headed up the Legal Strategies Commission, and past director of National Conference of Black Lawyers, very much embedded in the reparations movement. And I wish I could have gotten into the discussion, but my sister held her own, Nkechi. Thank you.
All right, thank you for being here. Okay, Rachel, we know about, and Nkechi, we know about. Ken Walker. Oh, Ken Walker, you haven't fully introduced yourself.
Retired journalist. Well, you never get fully retired as a Black person, maybe so. but from starting off with the Washington Star, then ABC News, and then National Public Radio. Those are my official affiliations, but wound up being associated with a great many organizations. But I'm semi-retired now.
Okay, John Funabiki.
Yeah, hi, sorry. It's hard for me to figure out how to introduce myself. Former retired journalist, retired professor of journalism, founded a nonprofit social justice journalism organization. I used to be a funder with the Ford Foundation, funded journalism projects there. Currently doing a lot of passion projects, including a documentary called Beyond Yellowface, which is about the problem of anti-Asian stereotypes in ballet.
Ballet. Okay. All right, thanks, John. Ruben, do you want to expand a little bit?
Sure. As I mentioned before, I'm a syndicated columnist at the Washington Post Writers Group for about now 22 years. Known Richard for a long time. Like Richard, respect Richard, enjoy Richard's company. I've always appreciated having Richard in my corner. Richard
Sounds
was one
like
of the
there's a
first people.
butt coming there.
Well, no. Richard was one of the first people who called me when I got laid off. I've been fired in 35 years of doing journalism. I've been fired or laid off or shown the door 15 times. And in one of those times, Richard called me to interview me for his column. And I am still writing. I still do now video commentary for a company called Straight Arrow News. I write the column for the Post, and I do some consulting work helping people and nonprofits tell their story. So I'm a storyteller who's helping other people tell their stories as well. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ruben. Very good. Randall Pinkston.
Hello, everyone. Retired journalist, sometimes teacher at various schools, most recently Morgan State, where I'm currently engaged with Dwayne Wickham and his new Center for Media Initiatives, doing a documentary on Ellen Irene Diggs, who earned her anthropology degree at the University of Havana and worked for W.B. Du Bois for about 10 years. And I think this is a great discussion. And no matter how long it takes, and no matter how difficult the issue may be, I am hoping that progress will continue to be made, because there's a debt and it should be paid.
All right, thank you, Randall. Ellis, do you want to add anything to your own?
Sure. I mean, I'm obviously a journalist, former columnist for Newsweek magazine, former editorial page chief for the New York Daily News. I've published 13 books. Recently started in a project called Renewing American Democracy in conjunction with several universities, where we are trying to elevate the discussion of democracy in this country. And we're in the midst of starting what I'm calling a talkback tour, where we'll be visiting universities across the country to talk about democracy and then get the voice of young people as well.
Okay, thank you, Ellis. Harvey Brody.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm here as a friend of journalism, I guess. I've been working with Ellis on his project that he just described. And I'm a professor emeritus at University of California, San Francisco, and former member of the Board of Regents at University of California. And am delighted to be here, concerned with how to get the word out to people who look like me, and to the kind of the people that have to have influence on the legislators when things come along down the road. And it's a kind of a fascinating role to, as an ally, to try to figure what I can do to help move things along from my perspective.
All right, thank you. Good to have you here. Min-Ho Kim.
Hi, I used to be intern for Politico magazine for 6 months. Right now, I'm at E&E News, which is Politico's environment and energy news. I'm covering climate and transportation. It's a pleasure being invited. I learned a lot today, and yeah, nice meeting everyone.
Great to have you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Chevry Lassiter, who's been our producer for the evening.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chevry Lassiter. I'm the producer for the Washington and former newspapers digital broadcast program on WIN TV. I think Nkechi, I think you were on our show with Denise, talking to Denise, and I'm the producer for that show. And I am also the photo editor, and I produce this with Richard. So nice to see you. Great conversation.
Thank you, Chevry. Roger Witherspoon. Oh, you got to unmute.
There you go. Hi, and thank you for hosting this again, Richard. I'm also semi-retired after nearly 60 years in this business, like the youngster Kenneth. But I have a question when you're looking at reparations, considering that the initial response of this government was always compensating the slave owners and those for property loss. There were always Blacks who fought back. And so 6 Klansmen rode up to my great grandfather's house and on a Sunday and blew him away in his dining room. His sons, after the funeral, then went and killed 15 Klansmen, including all 6 of those. And the Klan then later asked the family if they would leave rather than have another shootout, and which is how I wound up being a Yankee. But if one were going to look at that episode in terms of compensation, would they compensate me and the other descendants? Or would they say we owe the 15 Klansmen that were killed? I mean, how does this work out a legal system that's as biased as ours?
Okay, somebody can answer in the chat probably on that one. Mary C. Curtis.
Hi, great program as usual, kind of late. Mary C. Curtis, based in Charlotte and Washington, D.C., formerly New York Times, now columnist at Roll Call, covering politics, culture, and race, host of the Equal Time podcast, guest host for Slate What Next, and senior leader with the Op-Ed Project. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mary. Trahern Cruz.
I'm Trahern Cruz. I'm co-founder of BLM Minnesota and one of the co-conveners of the St. Paul Recovery Act Reparations Commission.
All right, thank you for being here. We learned a lot. Nichelle is back with us. Yay!
Good to be here, everybody. I'm Nichelle Smith, former enterprise editor for racism and history at USA Today. In December, with so many other people, the Grim Reaper finally stopped by my desk. So it was my turn. It was a good run of nearly 20 years at USA Today. I got a lot accomplished and was grateful for the platform to talk about racism and history. Now I'm free in 2023 and looking forward to what's next as I continue this identity and history walk that I've been on. Good to see everybody.
All right, we've been in your shoes. All right, Darren Snyder.
Good evening, everyone. Darren Snyder. Nichelle, you said you left in last year in 2009. I took a buyout from Gannett after 24 years, mostly at USA Today. Ended up doing 10 years with the Washington Times, former columnist, former editorial writer, former reporter, currently a freelance writer, frequently on thegrill.com, also on Anscape, FanBuzz, and various other organizations willing to pay me to write. And I do remember spending a week in with Ruben. I think it was Memphis. It was either Memphis or Nashville at some writing workshop of some sort.
It was Nashville.
Yes.
It was at Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt.
Right, Vanderbilt, yeah, Freedom Forum, yes.
Yes, sir.
Glad to be here, always a great discussion. I don't want 40 acres, I'll take 5 and a mule, that'll work for me.
Bill Geisler.
Hi, everybody. I'm the Bill Plant Chair in Leadership and Media Integrity at Loyola University Chicago. Had that role for about the past 6+ years. Prior to that, I was at the Poynter Institute where Karen Dunlap hired me to run the leadership and management programs there. And prior to that, I served as a broadcast journalist, one of the first women to lead a to be a news director in a local TV newsroom before they were giving those jobs to women. As someone who teaches leadership, I come to these meetings to learn how to help newsroom leaders learn from what I'm learning here today, and to inform the writing I do. The column that was published today for the National Press Club Journalism Institute, talking to leaders about how they have to be helping their staffs deal with the news that we're covering today. I'll share the column in the chat.
All right, thank you, Jill. Jeanette Pinckney. Unmute, please.
Hi. I first have to say hello to Adjua Ayatoro, whom I haven't seen for 1,000 years. So hi, Adjua. And Nkechi, but of course I see you around from time to time. So I am a semi-retired journalist, started as an intern at Channel 7 after some Black folks had taken over the studio and they decided maybe they needed to get some people of color in there. Worked as a reporter at KBJR TV in Duluth, Minnesota, for you Minnesota people, WETA, NBC, CBS, Phil Donahue's show, and then moved to South Africa and worked at the South African Broadcasting Corporation as they were trying to move from news being just propaganda to actually doing real news. And now I'm back here at home in DC.
All right, thank you, Jeanette. Elliot Francis.
Hey, thank you, Richard. Hi, everybody. I'm former television news anchor, reporter, currently the producer and host of Now with Elliot Francis, live streamed each week on Facebook and YouTube. I find it fascinating that this conversation has been going on forever. I mean, I remember having these conversations when I was selling Black Panther papers on the streets of Boston years ago. Yeah.
Whoa.
50 years later, we're still doing it, Richard, but hopefully with this discussion and many others, and of course, HR 40 and some of the initiatives going on in California right now, we can come to some conclusion and figure out how to go forward with all this. So looking forward to it. Great conversation.
Here, here. Okay. Sharon Farmer.
Power to the people, people to the power. I'm from Southeast. Had a lot of good jobs, still working because I'll never retire. Plus, until we're really free, like in charge of some stuff like, you know, the Capitol, the White House, all the people who police us, we got a fight going on, y'all. Thank you very much.
Sharon.
All right. Sandy Adams.
Hello, everyone. Sandy Adams. I'm with Exposure Group. I'm a photographer. This was a great discussion. Thank you.
Okay, and the Exposure Group is?
It's an African-American Photographers Association. And we're one of
Here
the
in DC.
Yep, here in DC. We're one of the oldest ones around.
All right, very good. Glad you're with us. Ron Allen, returning.
Yes, it's been a while. How are you? Thanks for the invitation. I'm at NBC News, where I've been for a while. It was especially good to see my former colleagues, Randall and Ken Walker from CBS and ABC, respectively. And of course, you, Richard. I ran across this while I was researching a story about the reparations task force out in California, which hopefully will come to fruition in the coming weeks and months. The report, not the task force. Great discussion. I'm in New York, where I've been for the last 20 years or so, and look forward to being in touch with some of you to follow this up.
Here, here. Okay. Hazel Trice Edney.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Hazel Trice-Edney, Editor-in-Chief of the Trice-Edney Newswire, President and CEO of Trice-Edney Communications, and an adjunct professor at the Howard University Kathy Hughes School of Communications.
Okay, thank you, Hazel. Marcia Davis.
Hey, hi, everybody. I'm Marcia Davis. I know many of you, some of you I don't know, but hello to everyone. I am the inaugural editor, the supervising editor of Race and Identity at NPR. And I'm very excited to be here. I've been here many times before, but not in recent years, but I'm glad to be back. And this is a very important conversation, so thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. Cynthia Robbins.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Cynthia Robbins. I am happy to be back at a Journal-isms roundtable, even by Zoom. I'm a fan of Richard's, whom I met through my husband, Jackie Green. Together, Jackie and I have founded Consult GR Team, a multifaceted consulting firm that addresses everything from racial justice and reparations to international business opportunities and health care advancement. It's a pleasure to be here with longtime friends and mentors, Nkechi and Ajua, on this issue of reparations that as a civil rights attorney by training and practice in the past, it's an issue of great concern. I learned a lot tonight, and it's great to be with you all.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you. Good to see you. Lynn Adrian.
I'm Lynn Adrian. I'm a member of the Advisory Board for Journal-isms and for the Roundtable. Recently retired from Syracuse University, running their graduate broadcast and digital journalism program in Washington. Previous to that was a longtime senior producer for ABC News and trying to figure out what's next.
All right. Thank you, Lynn. Jackie Green.
Good evening, Richard and everyone. It's a pleasure to be back. Quite often we can't make it because of travel, and you do these on Sundays quite often. Cynthia mentioned earlier what we're doing. For you who do not know me, have not met me, I'm Jackie Green. I'm a longtime member of USA Today, one of the founding team for over 34 years. I've retired from there. And we're doing consulting. Right now, our projects are primarily in Africa. We have several ventures going where we're working there and several countries there.
All right. Thank you, Jackie. Did I miss anybody? Okay, good. Well, thanks everybody for being here. We can, you can expect the results of the, or the entries in the chat room to come to your inbox sometime soon, and hope to see some of you next Monday. We're having a special edition of the Roundtable with at American University and also on Zoom with Dr. Julius Garvey, who is the son of Marcus Garvey, legendary figure of the 20th century, who also had a newspaper, which we will discuss, that was called the Negro World. So hope to see some of you, or actually I hope to see all of you and others, one way or the other, next Monday, February 6th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And if Chevry can cue it up, we have some trailers on reparations that we can use to entertain folks as they wrap this up. Thank you much, everybody. And as I said, thanks for coming.
You.
Okay. Let's cue it if we can, Chevry.
Thanks again, Richard.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Chevry.
Okay. Chevry, share screen.
Nope.
Nope, not seeing it.
Oh,
Well, let's go start the sucker up here.
you have it on mute.
Oh,
Yeah, there you go. Does that album have The Revolution Will Not Be Televised on it?
You're still not hearing it, Richard.
Richard, I think I have it. Do you want me to play it for you?
Might as well.
If you let me share the screen, I can put it up for you. I host these a lot.
Hey, Jackie,
Yeah.
does that album have The Revolution Will Not Be Televised on it?
I haven't heard it, but I just got it on my alternate screen here.
Who'll pay reparations on my soul?
Title. Is that back in the days when we all had hair?
Yeah.
Who'll pay reparations?
Here it comes. I'm sorry, I'm working too.
I haven't turn this thing off.
It won't work there.
That didn't work. Well, not working. Shoot.
It should be cash payment. I think what they're offering us is an insult.
How do you determine who's supposed to get it?
Yeah, I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago is a good idea.
HR 40 is we're pushing very hard. There's been a lot of debate and discussion about the bill.
This is a proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery. The institution of slavery has never gone away. Convict leasing, the oppression of voting, poll taxes, and racist GI bills. HR 40 is, in fact, the response of the United States of America long overdue.
I get this call from a dear friend. He said, man, you know, we got a bad sister in Evanston, and she's pushing the reparations question. Wrong.
And so it was Alderman Simmons. You have become the visible face and the driving force of the Evanston Reparation Initiative.
Some mornings I wake up and I feel like, wow, I'm a part of history. This is special. And then it's intimidating at the same time, because what if you don't get it right?
The greatest hurdle is the political will to make it happen. And Alderman Simmons made it happen, gathering a lot of evidence, specifically implicating actions of the city.
This program, as it is incomplete.
I don't know why they would be given more status than any other group of people.
People have been extremely nasty to me.
You don't give them money and then tell them what they can do with it.
You cannot say my grandfather back. He's dead. Give us what we're due.
I don't think it's gonna go too far. Well, anyway.
I'm still not prepared to join an insurrection. I just want you to understand who we are. We in Evanston are leading the way to heal a nation.
We don't want a piece of freedom. We reparations.
And then say, stand my messages for following by the conversation I will let you do that. Well, your name is on all of it. So why it's not working.
Today marks the 3-year anniversary of the Reparations War.
No more. As Commander-in-Chief, I'm mobilizing military, police, and deputizing every American citizen to face this unprecedented threat.
Okay. But that's where it is, under that. Well,
Hold on a second, hold on. Okay, that was it, Richard.
Okay, thanks, everybody. See y'all next time.
Take care, Rich.